Last year at Essenspiel, I was handed a lavishly produced prototype of a small card game with a very strange name. And this is it. This is Iunu. And I was immediately struck by its stark, minimalistic graphic design, the Egyptian theme that eschewed the cliched look. There's no papyrus font here. And vitally, a game design that hinted at being able to offer something quite different to most of the other small box card games that are out there at the moment. So I was very pleased to be offered the review copy. It was the first review copy of any game I'd ever received, and I was pretty excited about it. But then I played it, and it was alright. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't very good either. And most damning of all, it just wasn't all that interesting. And because it takes me such a long time to make a review, I tend to only review a game if it features design choices that are interesting for us to explore, whether those choices are good or bad. But Iunu was extraordinarily mediocre, not terrible, not great. I just couldn't justify spending the time on it. I felt a bit bad because it was the only review copy of a game I'd ever been given, and I didn't feel like it was worth my time. But then something happened. A few months later, I saw the game on Kickstarter, but there was one subtle change between what I saw there and what I had in my box. One small alteration to something in here transformed the game from something mediocre to something that was really very good. And that I find very interesting. The rules. It was the rules. This single sheet of paper had a number of changes on it. Some of them were fairly major, some of them quite minor, but all of them carefully and thoughtfully considered and designed to improve the playing experience and resulting in a much more fun, rewarding and engaging game. The rest of the components were almost identical, so in order to review the new version in a useful and edifying way, I'm going to compare the older version, exploring why it didn't really work and look at the evolution of its design, why those changes improved the game. So let's get to it. Okay, here in brief is how the original prototype played. You have a single deck of cards full of different citizens, such as bakers, nobles, etc. A different number of each. 1 pharaoh, 2 scribes, etc. all the way to 9 farmers. You start with a hand of them, as well as some deben, the currency of the game. And on your turn you get to play a single type of card. I'll play an artisan. If you have any copies of that card type in your hand, you may also play them into your tableau, paying a single deben for every extra copy that you play. Each citizen has a power, and depending on what type of citizen you played, you can activate this power once, regardless of how many cards that you actually played. More on that in a moment. Then you discard all but one of your cards. These will be shuffled back into the main deck. Next round, you'll get a new hand until 8 rounds have been played or until the deck runs dry. Scoring is pretty simple. Every card that you've played is worth some points, and if you have the majority of a set, you score the majority score for that set. So while the scribes are worth a lot of points on their own, they're not worth much in majority. Now, the real meat of the game comes from deciding what type of citizen you're going to play. And you'll be making that choice based on what you've played before, what your opponents have already in their tableaus, of course, what you have available to you, what the special ability is that you'll activate when you play them, and on the current values of the dice. These are rolled at the start of every round, and they indicate the favour of the gods, the wealth of the Nile. High numbers means lots of wealth. Many of the citizens' special abilities use these dice when activated. For instance, if you play a noble, you gain the value of deben equal to the total value of all the dice. Then each die is reduced by 1 for the remainder of the round. Any dice reduced to 0 are simply removed for the rest of the round. The lowly merchant lets you do the same thing, gaining Deben and reducing the value but only to 1 die. The baker can bake bread. This lets you purchase bread tokens, which look a little nicer in the newer version, by the way. Each bread token that you wish to purchase costs the same as the highest value die in play. You can buy as much as you like, and for each citizen in your tableau that you feed, you will gain extra points at the end of the game. Tasty. What's interesting about feeding your citizens is that the Pharaoh isn't much impressed by bread. He nets you only a single extra point, and so on down the ladder to the humble farmers, who provide a substantial increase in value if you feed them. But they aren't nearly as grateful as they might seem. See, these farmers are migratory workers, and as soon as any player plays a farmer, they may select another player and take all their farmers, including bread tokens, into their tableau. You can protect your farmers with soldiers, and each soldier protects one farmer, and he protects the fed farmers first. So sometimes you want high values on these dice, other times you want low. But the only citizen in the deck that gives you a chance at changing them to benefit you on your turn is the Pharaoh. If he is in your tableau, you can re-roll the dice at the start of your turn. Finally, the Scribe lets you secrete a single card beneath him, so that at the end of the game, no one knows if you might be able to steal majorities. The Artisan lets you keep an extra card back between rounds, giving you a lot more control over what's in your hand. And the Priests, each time you play a Priest, you can pick a die and draw that many cards from the Afterlife deck. You then select one and return the rest to the deck. These are multiplier cards, and they let you double, triple, or even quadruple your majority score for a single citizen type. If you do pick up more, then you can apply them to different majorities if you have them. And there are 3 doubles, 2 triples, and only 1 quadruple in the entire deck. And that's it. That's just about all the rules to a game that doesn't technically exist anymore. But now we've got a really good foundation to start talking about what works, what didn't, and crucially, how it was improved. Firstly, it's worth noting that at its best, Iunu can offer you really difficult decisions that are generally having you pick between a number of avenues that are all good. When you have an interesting hand that, for instance, has a lot of a single type of citizen, potentially letting you drop a large number onto the table at once, but also has a baker in there, and there's a 1 showing on the die, so you could potentially buy a kingdom's worth of bread if you play it now. But other players have bakers out there, so you've not got much of a chance of a majority in bakers. Or you could play the Artisan and keep 2 of the cards back for the next round. It can be very interesting, and there can be a genuine sense of building your tableau, playing lots of low-value cards for majorities or fewer higher-value cards for their points. Feeding or not feeding with a baker, there are definitely times when you're engaged and making interesting choices. But then there are the other times where the hand you've been given to you presents a no-brainer, and those aren't infrequent. I mean, if you're given the Pharaoh particularly early in the game, you'll play him, and that's you for the round. And who really made that choice? Wasn't really you. Also, when you play a card of a certain type, it's pretty rare not to just play every card of that type out onto the table if you can afford it. And you start the game with quite a lot of money, enough to play almost 2 full hands out onto the table, reducing your tactical choices even further. All of these problems are eliminated in the new version. Firstly, you start with far less money. This means any decision that you make that uses it has a much higher opportunity cost and therefore feels more agonizing. It also puts pressure on finding ways to gather the necessary money, opening up more strategic avenues to follow. Do you play in a way that brings in lots of money, or do you develop a strategy that doesn't require it? Vitally, however, the new version restricts you to only playing a single extra copy of a card. Now, even if you have a large number of farmers, it's not a no-brainer to play them all. You'll still be considering the abilities of all the cards, the tableaus of your opponents, and the dice on every turn. And this is so clearly much closer to the designer's original intent, and it's achieved with just these small minor tweaks. So imagine what you can do with a major change. Gone is the blind, uncontrollable fresh hand at the beginning of every round. No, the new design actually offers you some decisions to make, an ability to have some forethought and planning, and it's achieved through the forum. An open selection of cards drawn from the main deck that all players can see. At the end of your turn, you'll be discarding some of your cards into the forum and picking up new ones from it. I'll have this one, and this one, and this one. Now think about how this alters the strategy of play. It's massive. Now on your turn, when you're picking your cards to play, you have another new element to consider. What you'll be dumping back into the forum and leaving there for your opponents to pick up, as well as what you'll be picking up yourself when your turn is over. These are interesting and involving decisions. On top of that, it means that you'll know a little bit about your opponent's hands and maybe their strategies if you're paying attention to what they're picking up. Now compare this host of gameplay hooks to the blind draw in the previous version, which gave the players no control or choice, and you begin to see just how much better this version is compared to the previous design. Now, all of these changes are about giving you more decisions to make and more to consider when you make those decisions, and that makes it more fun. There were a host of other small niggling issues with the earlier version that, through judicious sculpting and careful design, have been completely removed or improved. For instance, one of the happy byproducts of the forum is that it has eliminated the need for the endless shuffling that took place at the end of every round. Now, seriously, it is something you have to consider. One of the unique selling points board games have over other forms of entertainment is their physicality and tactile nature. Looking at and manipulating these objects should be enjoyable and fun, or at least it shouldn't be boring and annoying, which the shuffling in the old version certainly was. It wasn't a deal breaker for me, but I'm glad to see it gone. Easily one of the most problematic issues the original design had was swinginess. A single move could have a wildly disproportionate effect on the final score. One of the major sinners in this regard was the afterlife cards. If you had the chance to pick these guys up, it was often a very good idea. Multiplying the score of a majority was a big deal, and if you could nab the card that let you multiply the score by 4 times, well, that was massive. Enough to shift the game's score considerably. But there really wasn't much other players could do to stop it, except go for those cards every chance they got themselves. Once again, a mechanism that lent itself to forcing you to play a particular card because it didn't make sense to play anything else. The deck was pretty slim as well, which meant that if you went in early, you had a good shot at getting that 3 or 4 times card. Not very exciting at all. But with 3 minor changes, this weakness can become a strength. Firstly, the 3 times and 4 times cards are out of here. The amount of points these cards were worth was simply too disproportionate. With this one change, we're already halfway there. Next, limit the players to only having 1 of these cards. You can still play further priests and have another look at the deck in the hopes of finding a card to replace your current one, but you can only keep 1. Which leads to the final change. You might want to do that because the new Afterlife deck doesn't just contain 2 times multipliers, it also contains personal goals or secret scoring conditions for you. You might get extra points at the end of the game for certain sets of different citizens, feeding more citizens than anyone else, or increasing the value of your currency at endgame. This is brilliant. Think about how this alters the game. These Afterlife cards are still valuable, but the personal goals provide a much more stimulating and interesting way of scoring them. They provide an additional challenge, and once again, something to think about in subsequent rounds when you're playing cards. Is that going to help me score my Afterlife card? You've also got the choice of sticking with what you've got or dipping back into the deck, hoping for something that suits you better. This is helped by the fact that you don't play with all of the Afterlife cards in every game. Some are randomly and secretly removed, so no one knows exactly what's in there. So getting one early might give you some strategic direction, perhaps. Now that's good game design. There are a couple of changes to how the individual citizen abilities work that I think is worthwhile reviewing too. For instance, the Pharaoh is now slightly less useful, only allowing you to reroll one die on your turn. Though I still think in most situations, if you have him in your hand, it makes sense to play him, particularly in the early game. Many of the abilities, such as holding cards back in your hand instead of discarding them to the forum, now cost money for every card that you apply that power to. And remember, money is much tighter in this version. This means that you'll have to decide how badly you want that special power right now, and puts even more pressure on your coffers. Speaking of which, the merchants in the old version were fairly miserable, essentially being a weak version of the noble. Now, merchants provide you money based on the dice and how many of them are already in your tableau. This is a really nice change, as it provides a small feeling of building up a generator, and if you focus on getting enough merchants in your tableau, they can end up actually being more powerful than a noble. But not the first time you play one. It was also quite common in the previous version to see a player bake enough bread to feed a huge number of their citizens when the price of bread was cheap, because it massively increases your score for little cost. Now, however, your bakers will refuse to bake more than 3 loaves a turn. This makes choosing to bake much more tactical, as you'll want to wait until the price is cheap, but also when you have enough citizens that will score well by being fed. Finally, I mentioned how swingy the original design could be. Well, one of my biggest grievances with that version was the way farmers worked. It was nuts how you could have so many cards stolen by another player who just happened to have one farmer in their hand. And although there was an attempt at mitigating it, playing a soldier to protect one farmer was incredibly costly. And since you couldn't play it on the same turn as you played farmers, if you played quite a lot of them, they could all be stolen by any player who came after you. And that was particularly problematic in the very last round, where going later in turn order gave you a massive tactical advantage, because you could see how many farmers people had, and you could often gain the farmer majority by playing a farmer and picking the correct player. Terrible. So it's gone completely. Now, farmers give you a discount when you bake bread. Very useful, given how tight money is in this version. Soldiers, on the other hand, not only protect 2 of your farmers, but when you play them, they steal a farmer from an opponent. Unless that opponent chooses to pay you a Deben. Much better. And I think that really ought to do it, don't you? I really hope that you've found this investigation into the design process of this little game interesting, and ultimately I hope you've been able to grasp what the new version is all about, and if it's likely to be a good fit for you or your group. If you enjoyed this review, you can subscribe to the channel to be notified when I produce another, and if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can click the link up there in the corner. I'm trying to do something a little different with board game reviews, and I'm keen to know if you think it's worthwhile or what you think I can do to improve. So if you have any comments or questions, please do get in contact with me through any of these methods. But that is it for me for now. So until next time, goodbye.